Hello, I want to talk about reference pitches in music, um, meaning the frequencies that we tune to when we are tuning our voice or an instrument. We have to have the same reference pitch in order to sing or play together. Um, and today in the West, meaning Europe, Americas, everything that has been, every place that has been Europeanized, colonized, Americanized, increasingly globally, the standard is the note A is 440 hertz. And as the pitch goes higher, the hertz increases, and as it goes lower, the number decreases. Um, I want to talk about the number 432, 432 hertz. When I tell people that I'm an historical musician, and specifically one who's interested in tuning theory, they say, "Oh, well, do you know about 432? You should tune to that instead of 440 so that your music will resonate with your heart chakra." Or I think the other number is 517. So I want to address this. It's a hoax, it's not real. Um, okay, so the Hindu tradition talks about chakras, which are like subtle energy points along one's spine. And there's one at the heart, there's one at the throat, there's one between the eyes, there's one at the crown. Some go lower, but they're not physical. Like you can't do an X-ray and see it, or an MRI. They're subtle energy nodes, and it's not my place to talk about the reality of that. But I do want to say that this idea of certain pitches in music aligning with certain chakra points is is BS. It's not part of the Hindu tradition. Um, I have traced it back to a set of New Age books from the 1980s. But before I get into that, I want to talk about the history of tuning standards in Europe. There were none until the 19th century, pretty much. There were local standards, but there was no overarching European standard. And Europeans didn't bring one over to the Americas when colonization started happening, or they didn't bring them anywhere else. Um, if you look at a lute tutor that survives from the 16th century, meaning like a book that teaches you how to play lute, it will say, tune your highest string as high as it goes before it breaks, and then tune the other strings in reference to that. So you take the highest pitch string and you just crank it up until it gets real taut and you get nervous. Then you stop, and that's your reference pitch. Now, of course, that pitch would change depending on the weather, the humidity, the climate, the season, the location. So if you're just playing lute by yourself, just tune it to whatever you want. And if you're playing with a buddy, you tune them the same. And if you're playing like small scale instrumental music, like in a domestic setting, you pick a pitch and you tune everybody to it. Now, woodwind instruments had a harder time because you can't adjust them as easily as you can with strings. So makers would make a set of instruments that match, that are calibrated to like the same pitch. Brass instruments had different crooks. So if you have just the most simple brass instrument is like an alp horn, just like a long straight horn. But that's too long and cumbersome, so they coil it up. So if you have just a bugle, no valves or keys or anything, but just a bugle, it's a coil. And if you want to change the available notes, like if you want to play in a different key, you have to attach an extra length of tubing to either make the coil longer or shorter. Those are called crooks. So you have a few preset crooks and you switch between them to adapt as necessary. So people had ways of retuning their instruments, and they did it as necessary. But there was no like overarching reference pitch. Things weren't that regimented yet. Now, if you were a church musician, like a chorister or an instrumentalist, you had to tune to the local church organ. Problem is, they were all different, and every time somebody would come over to tune it, they're metal pipes, right? They would take the tops of the pipes and hammer them out and reshape them to fine tune the pitch of the pipe. So every time an organ gets tuned, every time an organ would get tuned, it would shift in pitch slightly, in reference pitch, like the whole system would go up or down slightly. And then it would get to a point where the tops of the pipes would get so bent out of shape and weak that the tuner would have to trim off a little bit. So they would trim off the tops of the pipes and then shift them over one so it doesn't go up too high in pitch. But then it would fluctuate even more. So not only was every organ in every town different, but each organ would fluctuate over time. And string instruments have an easy enough time adapting, but woodwind players, either they had to use certain instruments or they just fudged it and transposed, used alternate fingerings. Like, people find ways to work around it, but Germanic places came up with a system where there was one set of pitches for choirs in church, and there was another for instrumentalists. But that was not a broad sweeping European thing. I don't know when that started. I know it was around in the 17th century and the 18th century. But there was no European fixed pitch until the 19th. And people came up with several. Basically, someone would come up and say, we need a standard so everybody can tune to each other. I propose this pitch. Let's tune our A to this pitch. And people would say, okay. But there were multiple ones proposed, and one of the ones that was proposed was 440. And there's nothing magic about 440 any more than there is 432 or 517 or whatever. But we have to tune to something. That didn't get standardized until, I think, 1955. And now that's the Western standard. That's what everybody tunes to. If you buy a guitar tuner, like an electronic tuner, it will be calibrated to 440. If you have a pitch pipe, 440. Harmonica, 440. Woodwind instrument, brass instrument, 440. If you have your piano tuned, they'll tune it to 440. And it's good because then we can all play together. Because if we're all tuned to something different, it's like the Tower of Babel. Like we cannot agree. So what's happened is there has been this New Age meme that appropriates Hinduism, and it's in the internet age. It's spread all over and become more complicated, and it's just confusing people. So what happened? I was able to trace it back to a set of books in the 1980s called the Seth books. The first one I think was called Seth Speaks. These were New Age publications, and evidently a person sat down and channeled the messages of a discarnate extraterrestrial entity, and somebody else wrote them down, and they published this as a book. So there's this entity named Seth, and he was saying, I love humanity, I want to help you, here are my messages for you. And one of his messages was that we're tuning our music wrong and that we should tune to 432 so it stirs the heart. Or I think another one of the pitches is 517, it doesn't matter. So that we should calibrate our music to our heart and our bodies. Problem is, every body's different. Like, we're all different sizes. Like, we're not factory products. So whether you believe in chakras or not, the Hindu canon does not ever mention any reference pitches, like any specific frequencies. So this is not a Hindu idea, even though it's citing the old chakra tradition, which is probably millennia old. I don't know. So this, as far as I know, this idea of 432 hertz, 517 hertz came about in the 1980s. And in the internet age, it spread, and it took on a dimension of, like, the Nazis intentionally set a new standard to 440 to intentionally decalibrate everybody and make everyone upset. It sounds like a cartoon, right? Like the Guild of Villainy, like, comes up with an evil plot. It's not real. I mean, they did plenty of nasty stuff, but this was not one of them. Um, A440 is just the same as anything else. We got to tune to something. The other thing I want to say that's BS is the historical performance movement, of which I am a part, um, really took off in the 1960s as kind of an expression of counterculture in the US and Europe. The young generation of classical musicians was saying, this stuff's too stuffy. We need to bring it back to its roots when people improvised and had a little bit more artistic freedom, so that we're not just like trained monkeys reading off of a page of music and playing it exactly the same and listening to records and playing it exactly like the record. They were tired of like cookie cutter musicians coming out of the schools and sounding the same. So that's a good fight, but what it did is it pissed off the older generation. And through the 80s, there were like all these academic battles, and people were fighting on one camp or the other, just fighting, articles back and forth. And there was a line that was drawn in the sand. The early musicians said, we're going to tune to 415. Now that's like a semitone, a half step lower than 440. And the justification was that a lot of the surviving instruments fit better like that, but so it was a new compromise tuning, one of many that have been proposed since the 19th century and like well into the 20th, halfway through. So that's no sin, but what happened was people started purveying that as Baroque pitch. I tune properly, I tune authentically, I tune historically to 415 as they did in the Baroque. That's BS, that's not real. And my argument is all that 415 tuning does is keep us from playing with other musicians. So if I pick up my lute or something that has been strung up so it'll be an optimal tension at 415, or God forbid I pick up a cornetto or something with fixed pitches, and I try to jam with like a pianist or a jazz trumpeter or somebody like anybody else, I'm not going to be able to tune. Like the keys we're both comfortable with will be maximally harmonically offset because our reference pitches will be a semitone apart. It's nonsense. Don't let any historical musician tell you that 415 is the way to go. Call that stuff out. And if anybody with love and namaste in their hearts tells you that 432 is the way to go, ask them to cite a source from the Hindu canon. Namaste.